Imagine everything you know about Eden. Now forget it, because before the garden, before Adam and before God said, "Let there be light," there was something else, an entire kingdom, a civilization that ruled the heavens and the earth. But something happened, something so serious, so destructive, that God decided to bury it beneath creation itself. Today, we're going to talk about the kingdom that preceded Eden, and that was buried beneath the foundation of the world. Why have we never heard of this kingdom? Why does the Bible suddenly begin with a planet without form and void? What existed before this chaos? And did God purposely erase this history to protect us from a truth that humanity is not ready to hear? These questions have always been up in the air, but ancient texts, psalms, and even apocryphal fragments suggest that, yes, there was a previous era, a powerful kingdom, a spiritual government that defied the very order of heaven. In Genesis chapter 1, the Bible begins by describing an earth covered in darkness, with an abyss and deep waters. But where did this abyss come from? Who created these waters? Did the planet already exist and was simply reshaped by God? Theologians, scholars, and researchers of ancient scriptures believe that it did, that the current Genesis is in fact a reconstruction, a new beginning after the destruction of this forgotten kingdom. And the most frightening thing is that this kingdom was not made of humans. It was not a civilization of flesh and blood like ours. They were spiritual beings with authority, with dominion, with technology and spiritual power that we cannot even imagine today. They inhabited celestial regions and also the earth until the day they defied the Creator. The result? A judgment that erased their history and buried everything under what we now call creation. And you may be wondering, where exactly is this clue in the Bible? The answer is right in the opening lines of Genesis. Verse 2 says, "Now the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep." Stop and think. God is a God of order. So how does the earth start out? In disorder. Why would there be darkness, emptiness, and a deep, even before the creation of light? This contradiction has puzzled scholars for centuries. Some scholars have called this space between verse 1 and verse 2 the creation gap. A theory that suggests that a catastrophic event occurred between the time God created the heavens and the earth, and the time he began to prepare the world for man. The prophet Jeremiah, for example, describes in Jeremiah 4:23 a vision of a devastated earth. "I looked at the earth, and behold, it was desolate and void, toward the heavens, and there was no light." Coincidence or a veiled reference to this earlier destruction? This theory connects with another curious passage. The book of Psalms, chapter 104, verse 5, says that God laid the foundations of the earth so that it could not be moved. But if it was created so solidly, why then do we find a planet in complete collapse at the beginning of the Bible? Could this be the result of a previous judgment, a punishment for a kingdom that dared to challenge heavenly sovereignty? And it doesn't stop there. In apocryphal books like the Book of Enoch, we find accounts of spiritual beings who ruled over celestial and terrestrial regions before the creation of man. Some of these beings would have corrupted the very essence of the spiritual world. The result? A cosmic judgment, an exile, and a complete reconstruction of the earth. God covered the traces of this civilization, burying it under layers of matter, time, and oblivion. When we examine the scriptures more closely, we begin to see the pattern is always the same. Something existed, fell, and was covered. The prophet Isaiah also gives us clues. In Isaiah 14:12-17, he speaks of the fall of a being called Lucifer, son of the morning, who made the nations weak. But to which nations? If Adam had not yet been created, who were these nations that already existed in the spirit world? And furthermore, how could a being have influence over kingdoms before humanity? It is as if there was a spiritual civilization, a heavenly government with territories, authorities, and structures that was corrupted and then destroyed. The book of Job also lets slip something curious. God asks Job, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy?" Job 38, 4-7. Who were these sons of God who existed before the foundation of the earth? Were they part of this buried kingdom? Some ancient texts, such as the Qumran manuscripts and excerpts from the Book of Enoch itself, mention heavenly cities, spiritual portals, and even dimensional layers that separated the different levels of creation. According to these sources, the present-day Earth would be only the visible surface, while entire spiritual civilizations remain buried in levels that our eyes cannot reach. And this is where the theory gains even more strength, because if this previous kingdom has been buried, it means that we are not just walking on physical ground, but on the ruins of a forgotten spiritual government. Every rock, every mountain, every ocean could be resting on the invisible wreckage of a civilization that was once mighty, but that defied the Creator himself, and so it was erased. If this civilization existed, why would God bury it so deeply, not only physically but also spiritually? The answer may lie in the biblical concept of spiritual judgment and divine forgetfulness. At various times, God uses forgetfulness as a form of punishment. Psalm 9:5, for example, says, "You have destroyed the wicked, you have blotted out their name forever." This would not be just a metaphor, but a literal decision to erase every trace of an era that defied the heavenly order. Another curious detail appears in 2 Peter 3:5-7, where the apostle speaks of an old earth that was destroyed by water, by which the world that then was, being deluged, perished. Many believe that Peter was speaking only of Noah's flood, but scholars point out that the term used in the original Greek indicates a previous cosmos, a world system that was judged and eliminated, even before the human era. If we connect this to what is written in Ezekiel 28, where the prophet describes a being who was in Eden, the garden of God, clothed with precious stones, and who fell because of pride, the question that remains is, what kind of being was this, and what kind of Eden was that? Was Ezekiel referring to the same garden that we know, or to a spiritual Eden belonging to that forgotten kingdom? There are also reports in extra-biblical texts, such as the Apocalypse of Abraham, which describe heavenly kingdoms that predate the physical world. According to this book, there were layers of spiritual existence with thrones, cities, and even armies, all before man was even thought of by God. The narrative describes God closing portals and sealing entire dimensions to prevent this ancient civilization from interfering in the new divine plan. But what could have led this kingdom before Eden to destruction? The most accepted answer among scholars is pride and rebellion against the divine order. The text of Ezekiel 28:15-17 itself speaks of a cherub that was perfect until iniquity was found in him. His beauty, wisdom, and power corrupted him. This being, whom many associate with Lucifer, not only fell, but took with him an entire spiritual structure, a true celestial empire that rebelled. The consequence? A sentence of destruction. Isaiah 24:19-20 describes a scenario of total collapse. The earth will be utterly broken, utterly rent asunder, violently shaken. Some theologians believe that this passage speaks not only of a future judgment, but of a catastrophic event that has already happened, the end of this pre-Adamic kingdom. God has dismantled that civilization and begun a new phase, the recreation of the earth. The Book of Enoch reinforces this idea. It describes how certain angels, known as the Watchers, ruled over regions of the earth and heaven before the creation of man. They possessed knowledge, spiritual technology, and power over the elements. But when they became corrupt, they caused a fall that shook the foundations of the cosmos. The result? A destruction so complete that only symbolic traces remained, hidden in biblical metaphors and forbidden texts. And even though the traditional Bible doesn't tell this story explicitly, the gaps, the silences, and the clues are there, waiting to be connected. Genesis begins with a planet plunged into chaos, and only then does God begin the process of restoration. But restoration of what? Now, the answer begins to make sense. Of a kingdom that preceded Eden and that was buried beneath creation itself. Over the centuries, scholars, rabbis, and even mystics have tried to understand this lost chronology. Some claim that between verse 1 and verse 2 of Genesis, there is a gap of time that may have lasted for ages. This theory is known as the gap theory. It suggests that the kingdom before Eden flourished, became corrupt, and fell all before God began the process of recreation described in the Bible. But there is something even more intriguing. The prophet Isaiah in chapter 45, verse 18, states, "For thus says the Lord, who created the heavens, the God who formed the earth and made it. He established it. He did not create it to be chaos, but to be inhabited." If God did not create the earth to be chaos, how come it was already in darkness and desolation at the beginning of Genesis? Yet another clue that something was drastically destroyed before our story began. And what about the ancient texts found in the Qumran caves? Many of them speak of a generation of spiritual kings who ruled parts of heaven and earth before humanity. They ruled with authority, but according to the manuscripts, they became wicked and were judged. Some of these descriptions speak of mountains that melted, heavens that darkened, and even heavenly gates sealed forever. The fascinating thing is that the evidence for this buried kingdom is not just spiritual. Some Christian archaeologists and geologists claim that the deepest layers of the earth bear signs of global cataclysmic events earlier than any human chronology can explain. Could this be the physical mark of the destruction of that kingdom? A silent testimony that God actually buried an entire civilization before beginning the work we know as creation? Now, if this civilization was so deeply buried, are there still spiritual consequences of it today? The answer is probably yes. Many theologians claim that certain spiritual phenomena we see today, invisible battles, oppressions, and supernatural manifestations, may be spiritual echoes of that forgotten kingdom, as if the vestiges of that rebellion were still active, but in another dimension. In Ephesians 6:12, Paul writes that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Who are these rulers? Where did they come from? Many believe that they are remnants of the spiritual authorities of the destroyed kingdom, beings who have lost their original home, but who are still active, trying to influence the present creation. In the book of Jude, verse 6, we read that the angels who did not keep their proper place, but abandoned their proper habitation, he has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day. What was this original state? Was it a position of authority in that previous kingdom? These texts reinforce the idea that before man, there was a spiritual hierarchy, and that it fell. And maybe that's why God decided to bury that story so deeply, so that humanity would never have direct access to the remains of that rebellion. That's why Genesis begins with a new creation, a new chance, a new story, without the visible traces of what came before. But as we're seeing now, the clues are still scattered, waiting for those who have spiritual eyes to see them. And now an inevitable question arises. Why did God choose to create man precisely on the ashes of this destroyed kingdom? Why not start somewhere else, in a new dimension, on a totally different plane? The answer may be linked to the plan of redemption that God had from the beginning. It was as if God wanted to prove that, even on a soil marked by rebellion, it would be possible to raise a faithful and obedient creation. In Romans 8:19-22, Paul speaks of the whole creation groaning and suffering in pain right up to the present time. But why would creation, nature, be suffering so much? Many scholars believe it is because it bears the scars of that previous judgment, as if the very rocks, mountains, and oceans still bear the silent memory of that kingdom that preceded Eden. Man himself, being created from the dust of the earth, may have a deeper connection to this story than we realize. In Genesis 2:7, God forms man from dust. But what dust was that? Dust that had already witnessed spiritual battles, the fall of thrones, and the end of an entire age. This gives a new dimension to the idea that we are made from the earth and that we invisibly carry the marks of everything that has come before. Furthermore, some scholars of ancient Jewish texts, such as the Midrash, suggest that God deliberately chose this earth, marked, judged, and restored, to demonstrate his ability to transform chaos into order, the fall into redemption, and spiritual death into eternal life. Man would thus be not only the new inhabitant, but the living symbol that God will always have the last word, even over a buried kingdom. Even with all this evidence, the truth is that most people will never hear a sermon on this subject. Traditional churches avoid touching on it. More conservative theologians prefer to ignore it, and biblical history books skip right over these gaps. But those who dig deeper, who are hungry to understand what really happened before Genesis, begin to see the signs. In Deuteronomy 29:29, it is written, "The secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things revealed belong to us and to our children forever." This means that if God has left clues, it is because he wants us to find out. But only those willing to look beyond the obvious and question what they have always been taught will have access to this truth. What we can safely say is that the spiritual world is much older, more complex, and more layered than our human minds can imagine. Spiritual civilizations, invisible realms, cosmic wars, all of this is in part of a story that began long before Adam took his first step in Eden, and somehow this story still affects us today. So, the question remains, if God was able to bury an entire kingdom and start all over again, what else could he be hiding beneath the surface? What other truths are still buried, waiting for the right moment to be revealed? The answer, perhaps, lies in the next chapter, or in the next great spiritual revelation that he chooses to bring to light. Jesus himself, in several of his parables, spoke of mysteries hidden since the foundation of the world. In Matthew 13:35, he says, "He opened his mouth in parables. He uttered things hidden since the foundation of the world." What exactly was he trying to reveal? What kinds of truths were buried, not just in the words, but in the very fabric of the reality in which we live? When we look at eschatological prophecies, we realize that God's plan was never just to restore man, but to restore all of creation. In Romans 8:21, Paul states that the creation itself will be set free from the corruption that holds it captive. This leads us to believe that at the end of time, all of these buried layers, all of these erased stories will come to light. Everything will be exposed. What was buried will be unearthed, And that is why understanding Earth's spiritual past is so important. We are not just talking about spiritual archaeology, we are talking about understanding the real battlefield we live on today. The struggles, the temptations, the spiritual conflicts, they are all part of a drama that began long before humanity existed. And that somehow has involved us, without us even having a choice. So, the next time you look up at the sky or at the ground beneath your feet, remember there, beneath it all, still lie the remains of a kingdom that defied the Creator and was buried beneath creation itself. What else is hidden? What will yet be revealed? Only time and the will of God will tell.